What if the one thing that has protected Vladimir Putin for 26 years is now gone? And what if the very people who once knelt to him are now the ones planning his downfall? Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like icon, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from. This channel exists because of you, and every share helps more people see the truth about what's really happening inside Russia. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin ran Russia like a business deal. It was simple. Stay loyal to him, and he would protect you. Serve him, and he would make you rich. Obey him, and you would never have to worry about your safety, your bank account, or your family. This was the unwritten contract that held his entire regime together. It wasn't ideology. It wasn't patriotism. It was pure, cold self-interest, dressed up as loyalty. Generals got promotions, private jets, and mansions outside Moscow. Bankers got sweetheart deals, government contracts, and protection from prosecution. Business owners got monopolies, tax breaks, and freedom from harassment, as long as they knew who really owned their success. Everyone at the top of Russian society understood the rules. Keep your mouth shut, keep the money moving upward, and Putin would keep you safe. That deal is what made Putin untouchable. Not tanks, not nuclear weapons, not even fear, at least not fear alone. It was the fact that the people closest to power believed that staying close to Putin was the safest place to be. As long as his inner circle believed that, no coup was possible, no rebellion could form, and no crack could grow large enough to bring the whole structure down. But something has shifted, and it has shifted fast. In just the last few years, that same bargain has started working in reverse. The men who once felt untouchable now feel exposed. The bankers who once profited from the system are now being forced to prop it up with their own survival on the line. And the business owners who once thrived under Putin's protection are now watching tax police. And wartime debt collectors dismantle everything they built. The machine that used to reward loyalty is now consuming the very people who gave it. Let's start with the generals, because what happened just recently in the heart of Moscow tells you everything you need to know about how fragile this system has become. A powerful explosion tore through an event in central Moscow, an event attended by senior Russian military commanders. This wasn't some random accident. This wasn't a gas leak or faulty wiring. This was a deliberate, targeted attack, using an explosive device rigged with shrapnel designed to cause maximum damage to human targets. And it happened inside the Russian capital, at a private gathering meant to celebrate one of Russia's top commanders. Think about what that means. For years, Moscow was considered the safest place on earth for anyone loyal to the Kremlin. The war was happening somewhere else, on the front lines, hundreds of miles away. Moscow was where generals went to relax, to celebrate, to enjoy the rewards of their service. It was the reward city. Now, even that illusion has been shattered. If a senior commander cannot feel safe at his own birthday party in the middle of the Russian capital, then nowhere in Russia is truly safe anymore. This attack reportedly targeted a gathering linked to a commander responsible for overseeing Russia's air defense, missile systems, and long-range strikes against Ukrainian cities. In other words, one of the men most directly responsible for the suffering being inflicted on Ukrainian civilians. And in that same room were other high-ranking officers, along with political figures connected to the war effort. Thus, this was not a random crowd. This was a room full of the very people running Russia's war machine. For those men, and for every general watching from a distance, the message is impossible to ignore. Loyalty to Putin no longer guarantees safety. Serving his war no longer means protection. It means becoming a target. And when the people at the very top of the military start to feel like targets instead of protected assets, something fundamental begins to break inside the chain of command. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because this isn't happening in isolation. Just one day before that explosion, something just as significant was happening in the financial world. Russia's largest state-owned bank issued a warning that should have sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. The bank essentially admitted that the money needed to keep funding Putin's war and his government's obligations was running dangerously thin. Now, ask yourself something. Why would a bank that is owned and controlled by the state, a bank that exists specifically to serve the interests of the government, suddenly start sounding alarms in public? Banks like this don't like to admit weakness. They don't like to spook investors or citizens. If they're speaking up now, it's because the numbers have become too serious to hide any longer. And when you look at those numbers, you start to understand why. Russia's government has been running a massive federal budget deficit this year, a gap between what it spends and what it earns that has already ballooned far beyond what officials originally projected. We're talking about a deficit that blew past expectations by well over 150%, and that's just from the first half of the year. The government's financial cushion, the emergency reserve fund, built up over years of oil profits, has been shrinking rapidly, and what's left is a fraction of what it used to be. To cover the gap, the Kremlin has been trying to raise money by selling government bonds, essentially borrowing from its own citizens and institutions. But here's the problem. When the government set its target for how much it wanted to raise through bond sales this quarter, it fell drastically short of that goal, raising only a tiny sliver of what it needed. Investors, even domestic ones, are losing confidence. And when confidence disappears, interest rates on those bonds have to rise dramatically just to attract any buyers at all. Right now, those yields have climbed into territory that signals serious financial distress, territory that tells you the market believes there's real risk the government might struggle to pay its debts back. This is where you have to be honest with yourself and ask a simple question. What happens to a country when its largest bank can't find enough money to keep the government functioning, when its bond auctions are failing, and when everyday citizens are pulling their cash out of the banking system as fast as they can? Because that's exactly what's happening right now. Tens of billions of dollars have already been pulled out of Russian banks by ordinary people who sense that something is deeply wrong. Every single day, tens of millions more are being withdrawn. This isn't panic caused by rumors. This is panic caused by people watching their own government's financial institutions admit in public that they are struggling. Before we go deeper into just how bad this crisis really is, I want you to do one thing for me. If this video is opening your eyes to what's really happening inside Russia, smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it helps more people find the truth instead of Kremlin propaganda. Thank you for being here. Now, let's talk about something that Russian officials have been trying very hard to keep quiet, something that could end up being far more dangerous to Putin than any battlefield defeat. It's the slow collapse of Russia's banking sector from the inside. Russia's largest bank is currently sitting on tens of billions of dollars in bad loans, money that borrowers simply cannot pay back. Across the entire Russian banking system, the total amount of troubled debt has climbed past $160 billion. To put that number into perspective, that's more than 3 times what the entire Russian federal government spends every year on healthcare and education combined. That is not a small crack in the system. That is a structural failure waiting to happen. And why is this debt piling up so fast? Part of it comes from the massive cost of the war itself. Years of military spending that has drained resources away from productive parts of the economy. Part of it comes from crushing interest rates. Rates so high that businesses and ordinary borrowers simply cannot keep up with their payments. And now, a new and devastating factor has entered the picture. One that Putin himself cannot control, no matter how many soldiers or tanks he throws at the problem. Ukraine has been striking deep inside Russian territory with increasing frequency and precision. Oil refineries, fuel depots, factories, and infrastructure across Russia's vast territory have been hit again and again. These aren't symbolic strikes. They are targeted attacks on the machinery that keeps the Russian economy running. Every refinery that goes up in flames means lost revenue. Every factory that gets damaged means lost jobs, lost taxes, and lost output. Every attack chips away at the foundation the entire economy stands on. And here's the part that connects directly back to that banking crisis. Businesses that have been damaged or destroyed by these strikes cannot pay back their loans. We're talking about hundreds of companies now formally requesting relief from their debts because their operations have literally been destroyed or crippled by these attacks. Imagine being a bank that is already drowning in bad debt, and now hundreds more borrowers are lining up, telling you they simply cannot pay because their factory just burned down. This is a vicious cycle, and it's accelerating. The war creates economic damage. Economic damage creates bad debt. Bad debt weakens the banks. Weak banks can't fund the government. A government without funding has to squeeze its own citizens and businesses even harder just to survive. And that squeezing is where Putin's relationship with his own elite class is falling apart the fastest. Because here's the truth about how Putin used to run things. He understood for most of his rule that you cannot completely destroy the businesses that keep your economy alive. Yes, he took his cut. Yes, he demanded loyalty and payments from oligarchs and business leaders. But he also protected them from excessive harassment because a functioning economy meant tax revenue, jobs, and stability, all things he desperately needed to stay in power. That protection is disappearing. Today, tax authorities and financial regulators have become one of the leading causes of business bankruptcies across Russia. Businesses that are still profitable, still functioning, still paying most of their taxes, are being targeted, squeezed, and in many cases pushed into bankruptcy by aggressive government collection efforts. This isn't about fairness or the rule of law. It's about a desperate government trying to extract every last ruble it can from anyone who still has money. Think about how insane that is from a business owner's perspective. You spent years building a company. You paid your taxes. You followed the rules. You believed that being useful to the state, being a taxpayer, an employer, a contributor to the economy would keep you safe. And now, the very government you supported is turning on you. treating you as a source of emergency cash rather than a partner to protect. This is exactly the kind of betrayal that breaks loyalty at the deepest level. It's one thing to lose money to inflation or bad market conditions. It's another thing entirely to watch the government you trusted actively hunt you down for cash because it has run out of other options. When business owners realize that success now makes them a target rather than a protected asset, something changes in how they see the man at the top. Let's pause here, because I want to make sure you're seeing the full picture, not just isolated stories. Generals are attending events that get bombed inside their own capital. Bankers are watching bad debt pile up to levels that threaten the survival of major financial institutions. Business owners are being hunted by tax authorities desperate for cash. Ordinary citizens are pulling their savings out of banks because they sense the system is unstable. And the government itself cannot raise the money it needs through normal channels like bond sales because investors no longer trust that the money will come back. Every single pillar that used to hold up Putin's power is showing cracks at the exact same time. And these cracks are not separate problems. They are all symptoms of the same underlying disease, a war that has drained Russia's resources faster than they can be replaced, combined with a leadership style that depends entirely on rewarding loyalty with money and protection that no longer exists. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, do me a quick favor. Share this video with just one person who still doesn't understand how deep this crisis really runs inside Russia. One share from you could be the reason someone else finally sees the truth. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because we're going to keep tracking every twist in this story as it unfolds. Now let's dig into why this matters so much, not just for Russia's economy, but for Putin's actual grip on power. Authoritarian leaders like Putin don't survive because ordinary citizens love them. They survive because the small circle of people around them, the generals, the bankers, the intelligence chiefs, the wealthy business elite, believe that supporting the leader is safer and more profitable than opposing him. This is the core truth of every dictatorship in history. The moment that calculation flips, the moment the elites start believing that removing the leader is safer than protecting him, the entire structure becomes unstable almost overnight. We saw this pattern before in other collapsing regimes throughout history. It's never really about the average citizen rising up first. It's about the inner circle losing faith. It's about the generals who no longer trust that following orders will keep them alive. It's about the bankers who realize that propping up a failing system will eventually bankrupt them personally. It's about the business elite who understand that their wealth is no longer protected, but is instead being systematically drained by the very government meant to safeguard it. Putin spent decades building loyalty through fear and reward. Fear kept people from openly opposing him. Reward kept people actively supporting him. But you cannot run a system on fear alone, not forever. Fear without reward eventually breeds resentment, and resentment, given enough time and enough pressure, breeds action. Right now, we are watching Putin lose the reward side of that equation almost completely. He can still arrest people. He can still intimidate people. He can still make examples out of anyone who speaks against him publicly. But he can no longer make the elite richer. He can no longer guarantee their safety. He can no longer promise that loyalty will lead to a comfortable, protected life. All he has left is fear, and fear alone has never been enough to hold a system together indefinitely, especially not when the economic pain keeps getting worse by the month. Let's talk about what this means for Russia's future, because the implications go far beyond just Putin's personal survival. A banking system loaded with bad debt eventually has to face reality. Either the government bails out the banks with money it doesn't have, which accelerates inflation and further drains the reserve funds, or the banks are allowed to fail, which triggers a wider financial panic that could freeze credit across the entire economy. Neither option is good. Both paths lead to more economic pain for ordinary Russians and more instability at the top. Meanwhile, the war continues to drain resources at a pace the country cannot sustain. Every missile fired, every soldier deployed, every piece of military equipment replaced costs money that could otherwise be spent stabilizing the economy. And as long as the war continues, Ukraine will keep striking economic targets deep inside Russian territory, continuing to damage the very infrastructure and businesses that the government desperately needs to generate tax revenue. This creates an impossible trap for Putin. He cannot end the war without appearing weak, something that could itself trigger unrest among hardliners who believe the war must be won at any cost. But he also cannot continue the war without further destroying the economy that funds his entire system of control. Every path forward seems to lead to more instability, not less. And here's something important to understand about how sanctions fit into all of this. For years, international sanctions were dismissed by some as ineffective, as something Russia could simply route around through other countries and alternative trade partners. But the cumulative effect of years of sanctions is now becoming impossible to ignore. Russian elites who once traveled freely, who once parked their wealth in international markets, who once had escape routes if things ever went wrong at home are increasingly trapped. Their money is frozen or inaccessible, their travel options have shrunk, their ability to move assets outside Russian borders has been severely restricted. This creates a strange and dangerous psychological effect. These are people who spent years building wealth specifically, so they would have options, so they would have security, so they would have an exit strategy if things ever fell apart. Now, many of them are discovering that their wealth cannot protect them the way they thought it would. They are increasingly stuck inside a system that is falling apart around them, with fewer ways out than ever before. When people feel trapped, they don't necessarily become more loyal. Sometimes they become more desperate. And desperate people at the highest levels of government and business are exactly the kind of people who start looking for a way to change the situation entirely, rather than simply endure it. If you've made it this far, I want to personally thank you for sticking with me through this deep dive. Before we continue, do me one small favor. Comment down below with one word that describes how you think this situation ends for Putin. I read every single comment, and I want to hear your predictions. Let's go back to that explosion in Moscow for a moment, because I think it deserves even more attention than most coverage has given it. For years, Ukraine has focused its most dramatic strikes on military targets directly tied to the war, air bases, ammunition depots, radar installations, and command centers. Those attacks made strategic sense in an obvious way. They weakened Russia's ability to fight. But an attack inside central Moscow, targeting a private social gathering attended by senior commanders, sends a completely different kind of message. It says that nowhere is safe, not even in the symbolic heart of Russian power. This kind of attack does something that battlefield losses alone cannot do. It creates fear among the people who are supposed to feel the most protected. Soldiers on the front lines already understand they are in danger. That's expected. That's the nature of war. But generals attending social events in Moscow were never supposed to feel that same fear. Moscow was supposed to be the safe zone, the reward for years of service and loyalty. When that safe zone gets violated, it forces every single senior official to ask themselves an uncomfortable question. If I can be targeted here in the capital at a private event, then is any location truly safe? And if the answer is no, then what exactly am I getting in exchange for my continued loyalty to the system? This is precisely the kind of psychological pressure that erodes confidence from within. It doesn't require a full military collapse. It doesn't require Ukraine to march into Moscow. It simply requires enough uncertainty, enough fear, and enough doubt planted in the minds of the people who matter most to Putin's survival. Now, let's connect this back to the bigger financial picture, because these two stories, the security failures and the economic collapse, are not happening by coincidence. They are feeding off each other in a way that makes the entire situation far more dangerous for Putin than either crisis would be on its own. A country that is losing its economic stability struggles to fund its intelligence and security services properly. Fewer resources mean fewer eyes watching for threats, fewer resources for protecting high-value targets, and fewer incentives for skilled security personnel to stay loyal when their pay and benefits are shrinking. Meanwhile, a country facing serious internal security failures struggles to reassure investors and financial markets that stability exists, which makes it even harder to raise money through bonds or attract meaningful foreign investment. It becomes a downward spiral. Economic weakness creates security gaps. Security gaps create more fear and instability. That instability further weakens investor confidence in economic activity. And around it goes, each crisis making the other one worse. For Putin personally, this is perhaps the most dangerous kind of crisis a leader can face, because it cannot be solved by a single decisive action. You cannot simply arrest your way out of an economic collapse. You cannot simply print money your way out of a security failure. Both problems require sustained, competent management over a long period of time. Precisely the kind of management that becomes almost impossible when your entire system is built on personal loyalty and fear rather than functioning institutions. This is actually one of the deepest weaknesses of any authoritarian system built around a single leader. When everything depends on one person's judgment, when institutions are weak and independent decision-making is punished rather than rewarded, the entire system loses the flexibility it needs to respond to complex, overlapping crises. Officials become too afraid to bring Putin bad news. Advisors become too afraid to suggest unpopular but necessary changes. And so problems get papered over, delayed, and hidden until they become too large to ignore. Exactly like what we're witnessing right now with Russia's banking sector and its increasingly desperate attempts to raise money. Let's take a moment to talk about what this means for ordinary Russian citizens, because they are the ones who ultimately bear the heaviest burden of all of this. While generals worry about their physical safety and business owners worry about tax raids, everyday Russians are dealing with rising prices, shrinking savings, and a growing sense that their government cannot be trusted to protect their money. The tens of billions of dollars being pulled out of banks isn't just coming from wealthy elites. Ordinary families are increasingly choosing to hold physical cash rather than trust it to a banking system that seems increasingly fragile. This kind of behavior, when it becomes widespread, can actually accelerate the very crisis people are trying to protect themselves from. When enough people pull their money out of banks at the same time, it puts even more pressure on those banks, making it even harder for them to operate normally, which can create the exact kind of banking panic that turns a slow-moving crisis into a sudden, dramatic collapse. Inflation adds another layer of pain. When a government struggles to raise money through normal means like bond sales, it often turns to printing more money to cover the gap. This might solve short-term cash flow problems, but it comes at a devastating cost. More money in circulation without a matching increase in real economic output leads directly to rising prices. Every ruble that ordinary Russians have saved becomes worth less and less, eroding their purchasing power at exactly the moment they need it most. So while the headlines focus on generals and bankers and business elites, it's important to remember that this crisis is being felt by millions of ordinary people who never wanted this war in the first place, who never benefited from Putin's system of loyalty and reward, and who are now paying the price for decisions made entirely outside of their control. Before we move toward the final part of this video, I want to ask you something directly. If you believe the world needs to keep paying attention to what's really happening inside Russia, rather than the sanitized version presented by state media, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next update the moment new developments break. Let's bring this all together and think about where this leaves Vladimir Putin right now in this exact moment. For 26 years, he built a system based on a simple promise. Stay loyal, and you will be protected. Serve the state, and you will be rewarded. That promise held together an entire structure of generals, bankers, business leaders, and government officials, all of whom had personal incentives to keep the system running smoothly, even when it meant looking away from corruption, repression, and eventually a devastating war. That promise is now broken in almost every measurable way. Generals cannot trust that even Moscow is safe for them anymore. Bankers are watching bad debt pile up to levels that threaten the stability of the entire financial system. Business owners are being hunted by tax authorities desperate for any source of revenue. Ordinary citizens are pulling their money out of banks in record numbers, sensing that something fundamental has shifted. And the government itself cannot raise money through normal channels because investors, even domestic ones, no longer trust that their money will be safe. This is not a system on the verge of a sudden dramatic collapse in the next 24 hours. Authoritarian systems rarely fall that quickly, and Putin still has powerful tools at his disposal: control over media, control over security forces, and a population that has been conditioned for decades not to challenge authority openly. But what we are witnessing is something arguably even more dangerous for him personally, a slow, steady erosion of the very foundation that made him untouchable in the first place. The elite around him are no longer motivated purely by ambition and greed. Increasingly, they are motivated by fear, not fear of opposing Putin, but fear of what continuing to support him might cost them personally. That is an entirely different kind of fear, and it is far more dangerous to a leader's survival than fear of punishment for disloyalty. Because here's the truth about power built on loyalty rather than genuine institutions. It only works as long as loyalty remains the safest and most profitable choice available. The moment that calculation flips, the moment staying loyal becomes riskier than seeking change, the entire system becomes vulnerable in ways that are almost impossible to reverse. Vladimir Putin spent decades making sure that everyone around him believed loyalty was the smart choice. Today, through his own decisions, through a war that has drained his country's resources, through economic mismanagement that has left banks drowning in bad debt, and through a security environment that no longer guarantees safety even in his own capital, he has managed to flip that calculation almost entirely on its head. The generals who once felt protected now feel exposed. The bankers who once profited now feel trapped. The business owners who once thrived now feel hunted. And the very system that made Putin seem untouchable for over 2 decades is now the thing quietly working against him, piece by piece, crack by crack. History has shown us again and again that the most dangerous moment for any powerful leader isn't when the public rises up against them. It's when the people closest to them, the ones who know the truth, the ones who control the money and the guns and the information, start to quietly calculate that maybe, just maybe, their future would be safer without him. That calculation is happening right now inside offices, banks, and military headquarters across Russia. And whether Putin realizes it or not, the very thing that made him untouchable for 26 years has quietly slipped out of his hands. If this video helped you understand what's really happening beneath the surface in Russia, make sure you're subscribed, drop a like, and share it with someone who needs to see the full picture. Stay with this channel, because we will keep bringing you the truth as this story continues to unfold. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.